I don't know about you, but I grew up on Tamiya paints. Ever since I joined the modeling world many years ago, Tamiya hobby paints, when they came out, were revolutionary. They worked like nothing else. They're so forgiving, and they were everywhere, and they're really good paints. So sometimes it's hard for me to imagine, having worked with Tamiya paints for many years, that other modelers who are new to modeling have never used Tamiya paints and may not know how to get the best airbrush results out of Tamiya paints. In this video, I am going to go over how to get the best airbrushing results from Tamiya paints. And once you understand how to do that, you will love Tamiya paints just like the rest of the modeling community loves Tamiya paints. Before discussing how to airbrush Tamiya paints properly, I think it's important to look at the strengths and weaknesses of Tamiya paints. And in the pros column, I think what's really important is they're very forgiving paints. That's number one. I think that of all the paint brands out there, Tamiya paints are the most forgiving for modelers. You can mess up and still recover from them, and that's what I mean by forgiving. So for example, if you blast on Tamiya paint at 40 psi, you're still going to get a okay finish. It may not be the best finish, but you're still going to get a finish versus other paints. If you screw up like that, the finish is going to be completely ruined. And if you go a little heavy-handed and it's wet and there's splatter or something, you can cover it up with gentle coats. You can't do that with all other paints, and that's really the key thing here about Tamiya. Is it's a very forgiving paint. Number two, they perform very well and they're versatile. Tamiya paints perform really well, and they perform really well in my experience no matter where I'm at. I travel for a living, and for a while I used to take all my modeling stuff with me. So I've been in 120 degrees in Phoenix and they perform well, and I've been in Denver, Colorado when it was below whatever and snowing, and they perform well. So like they're very good. You get the consistency of performance with them that I think sometimes you don't get with other paints. So that's one of the really good strengths of their paints. And they're also versatile. You can take Tamiya paints and you can do things with them that you necessarily can't do with other paints. You can turn Tamiya paints into washes if you want. You can turn them into tints, even into filters if you want. And that's a really positive thing with these paints, is their performance and their versatility. Lastly, they're readily available. No matter where you go, you can get your hands on Tamiya paints, and I can't stress how important that is, because there are other paints that, while they're good, because they're not readily available, they become a pain in the ass. I remember back in the day when I used to use Hataka orange line lacquers. I love those paints when I used to use lacquers. Unfortunately, they're a pain in the ass to get, because only two companies in the United States sold them. You'd had to reach out to Poland to get them shipped. It was just a hassle. So readily available is a really important thing sometimes I think people overlook. While Tamiya paint generally is very good, there is some cons that you should be aware of. And one of the biggest is the bottle. The bottle design of Tamiya is, one, inconvenient, and it's inconvenient because, as you notice, other companies have moved into the squeezable bottles with the drip tops, and this allows you to control your paint. With Tamiya, you have to stir up the paint, and you don't get precise mixture that way. You have to do a lot of guessing to get the right precise mixture with Tamiya. Another bad thing about the bottle design is the rim, or the top of the rim of the bottles, gets dry, and those paint flakes, when they become dry and fall into the paint, can ruin your paint. I've actually had that with a couple of my bottles where the bits get in and they kind of ruin the paint. So that's a negative too. And if you don't close the bottle properly, the solvent that the pigments are mixed in, that starts to dry out, and the paint can completely dry out. So there's a couple of problems with the bottle that I think that Tamiya really should consider moving into the dripper style bottles that, for example, Vallejo, Ammo, AK, and other companies use. Two, Tamiya is not a great paint for brush painting. It's just not. Simple as that. It is it doesn't behave well. It gunks up. It's just not good. Now, they have a retarder to help with the brush painting, but even with the retarder, you don't get smooth layers like you do with acrylic paints for brush painting purposes. So I think this is where a major weakness of Tamiya is. Now, that could be an issue that's not really a problem for you if you're not brush painting, but if you do brush paint or even brush paint the dials of your cockpit or whatever it may be, it is a problem. They're just not great paints for that purpose. So you always need something else better to help you brush paint. Even when I was using solely Tamiya, this was a huge problem. I had to use other paints. I used like the acrylic paints from Walmart for brush painting the dials on my cockpits and stuff, because Tamiya paints just don't work well in brush painting purposes. Lastly, the third thing is the smell. Now, I'm going to say they do not smell as bad as other paints. Remember, acrylic, Tamiya is an acrylic hybrid. It is not a pure water-based acrylic, so it does have a smell. It's not the best smell. It's not the worst smell. If you saw my video on how to airbrush Vallejo paints, I used my cat as a demonstration, because animals and other people who are not in the modeling hobby are far more sensitive to paint smells than us modelers, who have become nose blind to the smells of our hobby. So it does have a smell that I think us modelers ignore, but it's very, very visible. It's something that other people can smell very easily. I've had partners spend the night, and I remember one of my exes, she mentioned that, my room smelled of chemicals, and I had just sprayed Tamiya paint. So keep in mind, there is a smell. It's just not as bad as other paints, but there still is a smell, and you have to work accordingly. So make sure you put on a mask, make sure you're using a spray booth, whatever it is. You don't want to be exposed to that smell for long. The first thing to know about Tamiya acrylics, they come in either gloss, flat, or a translucent/clear color. And all three of them have to be airbrushed in a particular manner to get the best results. And in this video, I'm going to cover on how to airbrush all three. Tamiya is a strange paint in that it can almost be thinned with anything and everything. It can be thinned with alcohol. It can be thinned with its own thinner. It can be thinned with Mr. Color thinner. It can be thinned with lacquer thinner. I personally recommend not using alcohol. It reduces the surface tension. I recommend you use Mr. Color thinner from Mr. Hobby. It is the best for airbrushing Tamiya paint. Before airbrushing your paint, we need to talk about mixing your paint properly. This is really important, or you will not get good paint results if you don't mix your paint thoroughly. Over time, the pigments and the solvent will separate, and you need to make sure your paint is mixed properly before you can airbrush. I personally recommend using a vortex. It mixes the paint the best. There's nothing that beats it as far as I'm aware. So get yourself one of these vortex for about $20 on eBay. The biggest problem that I see modelers have with Tamiya paint is they do not understand that Tamiya paint needs to be sufficiently thinned in order to airbrush well. What they've seen is bad techniques from other modelers where they don't sufficiently thin the paint, but because Tamiya is forgiving, if you just increase the air pressure, they think, well, okay, I'll just blast on the paint and that's it. And the problem there is you're not going to get a nice smooth finish. You're going to get a rough texture, a grainy texture, and you're going to get a lot of overspray, as you can see on the test piece there, because I'm blowing on the paint. The paint is not sufficiently thin. It's not atomizing well. And so that's the biggest problem, is not thinning the paint. At a minimum, you need to thin 50-50. That's just the minimum, but the minimum needs to be 50-50 to airbrush Tamiya paints. Now that we looked at how to incorrectly airbrush Tamiya paint, we're going to look at how to properly airbrush Tamiya paint. And the key here is thinning. Tamiya paint really needs to be thinned well for airbrushing purposes. So here you notice that I'm adding in about 50% paint and 50% thinner. And this is the key. The minimum starting point for Tamiya paint, you have to be at 50% thinner, 50% paint. It's a very thick paint. It needs a lot of thinner. But 50% thinner and 50% paint is your starting point. From there, you might actually want to increase the thinner for better airbrushing results. And what I'm looking for is the paint to stick to the well and flow down. So I'm going to add this in. I'm using 20 psi here. I'm going to use the back flush method just to make sure I'm getting bubbles, so I know that it's going to go to the airbrush well. And as you can see, hopefully on the test piece, the paint is coming out much smoother than before on the other test piece. And it's laying down smoother as well. You notice it's coming in with a light glossy or satin-like sheen almost when it lays down. And that tells you the paint is atomizing much better than before. And you can get fairly good fine lines with this, but you need to thin it more if you want fine lines. This is just a good starting point to lay down the paint. And notice the coverage is really nice as well. In the previous section, I demonstrated how to make Tamiya paints airbrushable. And I mentioned you need, at the minimum, 50% thinner, 50% paint to get them to airbrush at the minimum. However, for fine lines, you need to reduce the paint even more. And you need to reduce it by 70% thinner, 30% paint. This way you can get some really nice fine lines and get in there and do some fine detail work if you need to. When you do reduce the paint, the coverage is not going to be as great as it was before. So as you can see on the tip there, I'm having to go over several layers to get the same level of coverage as before. So keep that in mind. When you reduce paint, you have to do more layers to get the same amount of coverage, but you will get nice fine lines, as you can see from the test piece there. Next thing I want to demonstrate is how to do mottling. Mottling isn't really that hard. It's something you just have to have a little bit of good trigger control with. So you will need to practice before you do it on an actual model. What you want to do is heavily thin your paint. I'm using 90% thinner, 10% paint at low PSI, and I'm coming in and I'm shooting small amounts of paint here and there, and I'm keeping my hand moving and my airbrush moving the entire time. If I get closer to the piece, the effect is going to be darker, or the tone is going to be more darker, and if I shoot further away from the piece, it's going to be a softer tone paint. And as you notice right there, I shot the paint really hard and you can see a splash effect. Keep in mind, when your paint is this thin, if you don't control your airbrush, you're going to get like a splash effect, and you want to avoid that. So be aware of your trigger action while you're doing modeling. But that's really all there is. Just keep your hand moving, thin paint, low PSI, and you should get a soft, misty effect, and it'll be a very nice modeling effect for your World War II stuff. Now we're going to look at how to airbrush gloss paint. And first what I'm going to do is I'm going to airbrush gloss incorrectly. I'm going to thin it exactly as I've mentioned how you should thin the flat paint, but I'm going to airbrush it incorrectly. And when you airbrush gloss incorrectly, you lose the glossiness of the paint. And the way I'm going to airbrush it incorrectly is using high PSI. I'm going to use 20 PSI for this example. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but even a small amount of high PSI with gloss ruins the glossiness of the paint. So I'm going to go ahead and take this paint, add it into my cup, and airbrush the piece. And it will turn out to be a nice blue here. I'm not saying it's going to be a bad blue, but if you look at that, it looks pretty brilliant. However, it's not really glossy. But if I take the same paint and reduce the air pressure and come back in and do wet coats close to the surface, notice that it's got a nice shine to it. That's why it's a gloss paint. It has a glossy finish to it. And as you see, as I'm building it up more and more, you'll start noticing the difference between when you airbrush it properly and when you don't airbrush it properly. You see the glossiness on that side and you see the blue on the other side. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of how to properly airbrush gloss. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to airbrush Tamiya clear/translucent paints. These paints are used for coloring in lights, things like that, and they're very nice for that purpose. However, they're extremely thick, so they have to be thinned very heavily for airbrush purposes. In this case, I'm using 90% thinner to 10% paint, and I'm going to airbrush it at a very low PSI. These are very nice paints that are really nice for painting lights. It's better to, in my opinion, to brush paint the lights than airbrush them. You get a nicer effect, in my opinion. I think that's why they're so thick. But if you do want to airbrush them for a large piece, for example, this is how you would do it. You're going to come in and you're going to be pretty close to the piece here. You want to go in nice and wet. You do not want to shoot from far away, like 5-6 inches. You want to be pretty close to the piece when you do this. Another little thing I learned about these paints and what can be done with them is they can be used to create a filter effect. And I learned this from the armor modeling community. Those guys have started using these paints for filters. So for example, I'm using this red translucent paint to turn the blue into a more vivid, darker gloss blue here. Something to keep in mind with these paints if you can use them for such purposes.